In today's world, peace isn't enough. Because when the bullets stop flying and the bombs stop falling, when the weapons are laid down, the dust settles, and the ink on a newly signed peace agreement starts to dry, what happens next? How do people who have been at war and committed atrocious acts of violence against one another come back together in one community? This is a difficult question, but it's absolutely imperative to find the answer if we want lasting peace. Each and every one of us as human beings has the power and the responsibility to help make this a reality. One idea that can help us on this endeavor is what scholars call transitional justice, which refers to how the pursuit of justice can help societies move from a time of violence, hatred, and war to a time of relative peace, unity, and prosperity. This usually involves implementing some kind of society-wide program to hold those who committed crimes during the violence accountable, to reckon with the history of a tragic past, and to help meet the needs of victims, survivors, and their families in the present moment. Transitional justice is a tool that can help repair societies that have been broken down by conflict. This practice really began after the Second World War, when human beings had proven ourselves all too capable of utter destruction. At the Nuremberg trials, members of the international community held Nazi perpetrators of the Holocaust accountable for their crimes. And this helped to redefine and strengthen a body of international law that outlaws what we know of as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of all crimes, genocide, or the targeted extermination of a particular group of people based on their social identity. Since then, these laws have inspired various countries that have experienced mass violence to seek justice in new and unique ways, all grounded in this ideal that every person's basic human rights deserve to be recognized and celebrated. As a researcher and a sociologist, I've traveled across the world to better understand what transitional justice is and what it looks like. The first country I want to take you to is Cambodia, which experienced a genocide shortly after the United States withdrew from its war in Vietnam. In April of 1975, a radical communist group called the Khmer Rouge took power. Immediately, they evacuated the cities, sending millions of civilians to the countryside where they were forced to perform agricultural labor. Many starved to death. The regime also created a network of security centers where they detained, tortured, and eventually executed men, women, and children that they believed to be enemies of their revolution. I visited one of those torture centers in Cambodia that has since been converted into a museum to remember the crimes that happened. And visiting this museum is an absolutely visceral experience. You can see the barbed wire on the facade, the dents in the walls, the bloodstains on the floor. You see hundreds of photographs of the victims that were taken by the perpetrators themselves as they cataloged each person that moved through their bureaucratic machine of mass killing. And finally, you see human remains, piles of bones and skulls stacked on shelves. They have no names and no faces, but they were people whose lives ended there. It's imperative for us to remember those who died in Cambodia, not just because they were human beings whose inherent dignity and worth means they deserve to be remembered, but also because it's a responsibility that we owe to future generations. Because to remember is to help prevent these crimes from ever happening again. And to deny that they occurred is to give those in power the opportunity to repeat. It was a memorial, much like this one, that first inspired me to start studying transitional justice. And it was in a small East African country called Rwanda that experienced genocide 15 years later in 1994. During a period of about 100 days, nearly 1 million people were killed when the government incited violence against the ethnic Tutsi minority, which they claimed posed an existential threat to society and therefore needed to be exterminated. People were killed by soldiers and militia members, but sometimes even by neighbors, friends, or family members who were influenced by this hateful ideology. People were killed in their homes, in their schools, on the streets, and in their churches, like this one. This is the Nyamata Genocide Memorial. It's a Catholic church where thousands of Tutsis sought refuge during the violence and were later massacred. You can see piles of dirty and blood-stained clothing on the floor that were recovered from the bodies of the victims and remind us of the lives that were lost there. When I traveled to Rwanda 3 years ago to study the genocide, this site broke my heart. But what I saw outside those walls gave me incredible hope. I saw community members volunteering their time to wash the bones of the victims with their bare hands, preparing them for burial. It was in that moment that I realized justice isn't always about creating a high-level tribunal that can hand down sentences to the perpetrators of international crimes. Sometimes it's as simple as burying the dead, but it should always be about restoring communities. The violence in Rwanda was so catastrophic, almost no one was left untouched by it. And because of that, the government knew it had to do something different to address the very real need for social reconciliation that existed in the country. They created an innovative justice mechanism called the Gacaca courts. In the native language of Kinyarwanda, Gacaca means grass, and that's exactly where these courts took place, outside in people's communities, where they elected trusted neighbors to sit on a panel of judges and listen to the testimonies of perpetrators, victims, survivors, and their families, who were able to meet face-to-face and tell their stories. These courts were empowered to pass down sentences, but they also strongly emphasized reconciliation and forgiveness. The fruits of this process are extremely evident in Rwanda today. Immediately after the violence, people thought it would take hundreds of years for Rwanda to look anything like a functioning state again. And yet, just 25 years later, Rwanda has rapidly become a prosperous and developing country. The Gacaca courts weren't perfect, but they were part of this success story. And there are lessons we can learn from Rwanda's experience to help us address ongoing instances of mass violence today. The last country I want to talk about is one you've probably heard about recently. It's been in and out of the news since it began just about 10 years ago. In 2011, when the Syrian civil war started, most of the world sat back and watched. We watched as entire cities were sieged and turned to rubble. We watched as hundreds of thousands of civilians were murdered, sometimes by illegal weapons of war like cluster bombs and chemical agents. And we watched as millions of desperate people fled their homes and sought refuge in camps like this one in Turkey. And we're still watching this today as a humanitarian crisis looms in Idlib right now. What does justice look like for a place like Syria, where the political situation is so complex and the wounds are so deep? This question has motivated my research for the last 2 years. I've drawn from a database of interviews with Syrians and also from interviews I conducted myself with Syrian refugees in Jordan to help answer this question. We asked people what justice meant to them and what it could possibly look like for their country. And overwhelmingly, despite differences in people's political leanings or religious identification, people believed that justice was an important part of pursuing long-term peace in Syria. This is good news, but of course it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Everyone enters a justice process bringing different experiences, needs, interests, and hurts that all need to be reconciled. But to the policymaker who asks for some simple, clear-cut solution for how to achieve justice after mass violence, I would say you're asking the wrong question. Because to pursue justice isn't to identify the perfect trial or truth commission or reparations program that will just make the problem go away or even meet everyone's needs perfectly. What I've learned is that seeking justice is really about creating a disposition within ourselves to seek it in our daily lives. To be willing to have uncomfortable conversations with people who are different than us, whose interests might be contrary to ours, and who may have hurt us in the past. And to be open to seeking understanding, compromise, and a way to live together. Because ultimately, we live in one community and one world. And at some point, we need to figure out how to do that. Transitional justice is just one way we've started to try. These stories of Cambodia and Rwanda and Syria should encourage you to ask what justice means in your own life, in your family, in your community, in this country, and in the world. Because it's going to take each and every one of us if this is going to become our reality. But if we continue to strive for a more just world, it's not only possible, it's inevitable. Thank you.